Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this TA session. My name is Molly Cook with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support at Illinois State University, and I'm here with Kenneth Williams and Sarah Blaylock, and today we'll be talking about Grants 101. If you have questions as this webinar proceeds, please post them in the Q&A or chat box, and we will address them at the end of the webinar. A reminder that this presentation is recorded. The presentation, recording, and any materials presented today will be available on the Illinois WorkNet website. In an effort to be as accessible as possible, this webinar is offering closed captioning, and the recorded session will encompass closed captioning as well. A reminder that if you have a faulty internet connection or would prefer to call in, you can do so by calling into the webinar using the phone number in your original registration email. With that, let's go ahead and get started. So like I mentioned, I'm Molly Cook. I'm a workforce research coordinator, and I am really passionate about grants and grant writing. I am a former development director of a homeless shelter, and have also done some grant writing consulting in the past.
Good morning, I'm Kenneth Williams, relatively new to DCEO. I have about 3-decade-long history of working in social services, writing, submitting, and reviewing grants for various fields such as addictions, homeless services, HIV, and other areas. Excited to have hopefully some newcomers, people who are just starting out on their grant writing path today.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Blaylock. I'm a grant manager intern at the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity in the Office of Employment and Training. And I'm new to grant writing, but I have been a part of the grant review process and the NOFO development process as well.
Great, so today we're going to talk about the parts of applying to a grant, from looking at a NOFO, the grant writing cycle, from pre-writing to writing to submitting your application, and resources to help guide you along the way. So as we start, we want to start with some introductions, and we can go ahead and do these in the chat box. So first of all, if you could just write in the chat, introduce yourself to us, let us know your name, and then start to think about how you might describe what your organization or agency does. This is something that's really important in grant writing, to be able to clearly articulate what it is that your agency or organization does and what your mission is. So there are some bullet points at the top of this slide to consider. What is your mission? Which population do you serve? And how do you deliver services? So go ahead and take a minute to sort of think about that. Think about how you'd introduce what you do, and what population you serve. And then as you think of that, feel free to share it with us in the chat. We'll take us a couple of seconds to do that now. Great, I'm seeing some come through the chat. That is awesome. Hello, Emily. Hello, Jennifer. Thank you for joining us today. So glad to have you. Please continue introducing yourself and sharing with us what it is that you do in the chat box. We'd love to see those filter in throughout the session. So we'll move on to the next slide, but please feel free to introduce yourself to us. Thanks, Deanna. Kelly. So next, we are going to go through the grant life cycle. And in the grant life cycle, we have 3 phases. We have our pre-award phase, our award phase, and our post-award phase. So in the pre-award phase, we're going to be looking for different funding opportunities. We're going to be writing the application. We're going to be working through that application process. And then once our application is submitted, it will be reviewed by a team. So your application is submitted, it's reviewed by a team, everyone loves it, it's great, it's perfect, it's wonderful, and then you get funded, which is great. So then we move into the award phase. So in the award phase, the review team is going to provide some recommendations in terms of the amount of your award. And in the case of a state grant or the NOFOs we're talking about today, like the J10 NOFO, there'll be some forms that come along with that, a program risk assessment, and then a notice of a state award and a grant agreement. So you'll spend the next however many months implementing your grant, doing great, awesome work. And then in the post-award phase, you'll do some reporting, talk about your successes, talk about the metrics that you were able to reach and the people that you were able to assist with these grant funds. It's a potential that you'll have an audit, and then you'll have a grant closeout to really wrap up all that you've done. This is a really high level overview, but what's really helpful and has helped me really process through this is on the Illinois Works website, or on the WorkNet website, there is a Grants 101 page that really goes into a lot of detail on each section of this. So I'm going to post that right now in the chat. So if later you want to refer back to the pre-award phase, for example, and learn more, you can always just look right on back there. And we have so many people who have introduced themselves in the chat right as I pasted this. This is awesome. It looks like we have a really wide variety of organizations, colleges. This is so cool. Thank you everyone for sharing. This is great. Okay, we can go to the next slide.
All right. Well, thanks, Molly, for talking about that process. I'm going to go over some key terms. This is not exhaustive, but these are ones that you might run across while writing a grant. So an award is a financial assistance that provides support or stimulation to accomplish a public purpose. So this is like the goal, right? The budget is the financial plan for the project or program. And Kenneth will talk about that later in this presentation. A close date is the deadline designated by the grant making agency. That one's super important. A data universal numbering system number is the 9-digit number established and assigned by the Dun and Bradstreet Incorporated to uniquely identify entities. And that will be touched on later and as well as in our GATA presentation. Eligible entities is any entity that qualifies to apply for the grant or to be helped by the grant. A funding period is a period of time when funding is available for obligation by the recipient. Grant agreement, a legal instrument of financial assistance between the funder and grantee. A non-federal entity is a state, local government, Indian tribe, institution of higher education, or a nonprofit organization. The project cost is the total allowable cost incurred under an award. Project period is the period established in the award document during which awarding agency sponsorship begins and ends. And that's a little bit of what Molly just touched on. The target population is the population that the NOFO or applicant has identified as being the target of programming. And the NOFO is a notice of funding opportunity. And the grants.gov is also a great resource, as well as Illinois WorkNet for finding and defining some key terms in grant writing. So we're going to get into step one, the pre-writing phase.
So pre-writing, why are we doing this? Obviously, for most entities, the short answer is money. As we go through this process here, we want to make sure that we really impart upon you a few things, and that is really making sure that you're doing the right thing for your community and for your agency. So why grants? It's critical, especially for nonprofits, to create a stable funding and revenue plan that helps your organization grow and be stable. Grants can do a lot of things. Obviously, it can provide seed money for something new. You can support essential operations to keep yourself going. It can also help you grow, doing what you're already doing, but doing it well or with a little bit less stress. It can meet the agency and community needs. I'd like to talk about the community needs, especially during this economic time that we're facing now. I can think of a time during another troubling era where many agencies in my area, in the Chicago area, were closing. CBOs and nonprofits were shutting down due to lack of funds. So existing agencies were able to find grants to help meet the community need to fill the void that closures were causing. Grants can also enhance program accountability and impacts. This is something really tied to the next bullet point of credibility. What it can do is make sure that you as an agency are tracking and following and really staying true to what you said you want to do and what the community and your clients say that you need to do and should do. By providing credibility, it can help you as an agency show other funding sources that we are worthy, and that's a terrible way to say it, but it shows that you are worthy of getting additional funding. But again, all of these things are really only if the fit is right. Don't just chase the money. Make sure that the entity you're requesting the funds for fits with your mission and your program. So how do you find out what you can do and where you can get resources? There are multiple places you can find information on the internet through seeking contact with peers and other entities that you know. There are different resources, state and federal government entities, obviously, and foundation grants are the two biggest sources. Funding can be discretionary or program specific. When we talk about discretionary, it really is what it sounds like. You're freer to do what you need to do, as opposed to being tied to specific activities and expenditures from a grant. Here are two really good sources to begin looking for grant opportunities: DonorBox and grants.gov. And each of those sites has additional sites you can check out.
Great. So when you're looking at these different grant opportunities that Kenneth described, there are a lot of questions that you can ask yourself to figure out if you are a great fit with the grant and if that grant, that funding source is a good fit with you. So asking yourself, what gap is your program filling? What need is currently not being met that your program is able to fill? As you're working on your annual budget, where are there some areas in your funding where you could use a little bit more cushioning, where you could expand to be even better? What areas do you need a little extra funding? Which of your programs could be improved with extra funding? Have you had aspirations and dreams to be able to help additional participants, but just not have the capacity to do so? Does your program fit within the grant opportunities that you're reading about? So like Kenneth said, it's important not to try and change and make your program fit what the funding opportunity is, but looking that you're already a fit and you already make sense. I love to ask this question: which programs have been funded in the past? Now, you may be looking at a grant opportunity and this could be the first time it's been available, in which case you can't ask this question. But sometimes grants are offered, grant funding is offered, you know, every couple of years. It's been offered in the past. It's really helpful to look back and see which other organizations have been funded in the past to get an idea of how they, like, what their programs were like, what successes they had. We don't always have to reinvent the wheel, so it's good to see what has already worked. Asking yourself, what is your capacity to utilize this funding within the timing requirements? Do you have the staff capacity to be able to implement the activities that you're saying you will in this grant? Is there a way your program could be broken down into phases if perhaps the answer to the last question was no, like we want to grow this program, we don't have the capacity to though? Is there a way you could break it down into phases and maybe you could fund a first phase of funding? So maybe you want to help 50 youth over the next 5 years, but you're looking for funding to try a pilot with 10 youth this year. And then finally, how will your program continue once this grant funding ends? And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So right now we are going to actually go through reading a sample NOFO, and this is the current JTED NOFO that was recently released. So I'm going to share my screen right now so that we can go through that together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take our PowerPoint and just put it right next to this so that you can see. So Sarah or Kenneth, can you see both the PowerPoint with the words review the following and also this NOFO?
Yes.
Okay, awesome, great. So often NOFOs are quite lengthy. This one happens to be 62 pages. And I know sometimes looking at that, it can feel a little daunting at first, but I follow these steps to really break it down and make sure that I'm a good fit and the grant funding is a good fit for me and my organization. So the first thing I look at is I just kind of briefly review the program description. Why is this funding opportunity available? Why now? And what is it that the funder is looking for? Like what need do they want to fill? And am I already filling it? So that happens to be page 1. So before I go any further, after looking over the program description, I am going to look at eligibility information before I go any further, because I want to know if I'm actually eligible before I read through every single page just to find out I'm not actually eligible. So the way I do this is I just Control F and I just type in eligibility. So here I already kind of looked ahead here and I know that eligibility is discussed on page 16. So here they have a whole section talking about eligibility and who's qualified, what eligible applicant entails, cost sharing, and different matters like that. So you've looked through program description, you've looked and you can confirm that your organization is eligible. Awesome. Next, I want to know, when is this application due and what are the submission requirements? Do I have the materials they need or can I find them? And can I meet that application deadline? So on this NOFO, that happens to be on page 19. Now, again, I had an unfair advantage. I pre-read this, so I knew the pages for all of this. But when you're going through and reading it, I just use the find box and just type in like application, and you'll be able to find this really quickly. Or there's a table of contents. Okay, so on page 19, there's a section requiring that reviews application and submission information. So you can look at who you're submitting to, the components, capacity requirements, different program plans, and it goes into a lot of detail of exactly what it is that you'll need. And this is a really good place to just kind of look and think, you know, can I meet the timelines? Can I meet the submission date and time? And what I always tell myself is that here you'll see it says the application deadline is 5 p.m. on October 29th. I don't even think in my calendar, I'm going to write that the deadline is October 28th at 5 p.m. I'm always going to tell myself a day earlier just to be safe. So just keeping those things in mind. Okay, so once I've understood the description, I know I'm eligible, I know I can meet the deadline, I'm going to look at the requirements to see what exactly are the requirements of this funding opportunity. So I would just type that in there, and on here it's on page 18. So again, here are some of the eligibility criteria, and here are the exact program requirements. And so as you'll see here, it looks like you're directed to a few other pieces of policy, which would be really important and relevant to take some time to read. So finally, my last step is, I still feel like I check all the criteria here. So my last step is I want to look at how they're going to be reviewing these applications, because that also gives me a window into what the priorities are of the funder and what they're really putting the most weight on. So here we have on page 23, here's our application review criteria. So they're going to be looking at things like your capacity, documentation of need, and I'm also looking at these percentages. So describing the need, I'm going to want to spend a little bit more time on that part than the capacity, because it's a little bit of a more weight. I'm going to want to spend even a little more time looking at the program plan. So just keeping those things in mind and how you allot your own energy and time as you're working on this application as well. And here you'll also read about the review and selection process. So those are all the parts that I read first. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Those are all of the parts that I read first before I then go back and read the whole thing. So at that point, I would really encourage you to go back and read through all the other parts, do a close read, break it down. But by looking at some of that information in advance, like your eligibility and the submission information, you're really saving yourself a lot of time and making sure you're a good fit before you get too far into the weeds. So a few tips and tricks for when you are, again, reading through these funding opportunities. Like I mentioned, read the application, look for those key components, and then read it again. And then probably read it 3 more times and ask someone else to read it too, because there's always little tidbits you'll find and look at. I'll give one little anecdote. We were working on an application a couple of years ago for an entity, and I had read it probably 8 times, many times. I thought I could like recite it to you as a poem maybe, but then I asked one of my coworkers to read it, and she's like, Molly, it says that we can contact them for technical assistance. Like in this particular one, you can literally contact them. And I was making up answers to all of these questions that were incorrect. And I could have asked them the whole time and I missed that reading it. So like that was a really key thing. So another set of eyes is great. Paying attention to deadlines, looking for requirements. Sometimes on certain grant or on certain NOFOs, they'll say that you need to submit a letter of intent in advance, and that would be an important deadline to notice. There could be 2 phases of application deadlines, so really making note of those. Looking at the target population requirements, and often there'll be a note of what sort of those target populations are, and making sure that, again, you're a fit. noting all of the eligibility requirements, and then really looking for that rubric or the application review information to get a good sense of what is being looked at. A really nice way to look at a NOFO is to look at those application components, those application requirements, and breaking them down into sections to figure out sort of what amount of time to allocate to each section and how are you going to split up this work. Perhaps you're at an agency or an organization where you're the grant writer and you'll take sole responsibility for many of these tasks. Perhaps you're at an organization where you have a team. So it'll be really important to take each of these components of a grant application, assigning a staff lead to it, just so you know that all the parts are covered. And then really considering the grant application process or the grant narrative to be a two-step process, a draft and a final draft. In general, one set of eyes should not be the only set of eyes looking at an application, just simply for grammar and spelling reasons, but also just to make sure that everything's being covered. So making sure that there's someone to review your drafts. If you need to send your application through multiple different individuals for approval, such as an executive director, a board president, et cetera, giving them time and giving some buffer for that and for feedback. And then at the bottom, I put date of discussion with implementation team. This will vary based on processes at your organization, but something that I found really helpful is that when I was working in development as a grant writer, I wasn't necessarily the one implementing the programs day to day as the frontline staff. So it was really important for me to have a discussion with the team, the staff who was working with program participants on a daily basis to make sure I had a really good understanding of what their capacity was, what their needs were, what they were feeling, because at the end of the day, the implementation of a grant is a team effort, and it's good to make sure everyone's on the same page. I also put the final submission date, as we noted before, at least 24 hours before the due date. Just assuming there's always going to be a technical problem is, a great rule of thumb. The internet will always go down on the day it's due, just assuming that for yourself. And then the staff responsible for submission. I wrote that down too, just even if it seems obvious, making sure you call out who the person will be who's going to be submitting the grant application so that it doesn't come down to two people thinking one of them's doing it and it's just not getting done. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. These are just some fun tools that I'd love to share with you. So often, as I mentioned, when we are working on grant applications, there may be several of us who are either pulling data, working on the review, and it's quite a few different moving parts to coordinate. So I wanted to show you some resources to sort of help out with that we found useful. So the first is called Padlet, and I'm going to show you two different Padlets. I love Padlet. Padlet is my favorite. I only discovered it in the past year, and it's essentially an online bulletin board where you can put Post-it notes. It's free to use. And here's an example of one that I've sort of expanded out more from a project I was working on earlier this year. You can post links, you can post Excel sheets, you can post, a PowerPoint, you can write notes. So here I posted that Grants 101 link on Illinois WorkNet. And all I would need to do is, let's say that you're gathering with a team all these different data resources or photos or whatever it is for your grant application. To keep it organized, you can just push this button and you can post a link, you can post a photo, you can post a video, all of that right on this Padlet so that you can see all of your resources in front of you. And sometimes it can be overwhelming if you're working with a team and every time you find a link, you email it because they can get lost. So this keeps everything organized and in one location. And I'll put the links to all of these resources in the chat just after I'm done showing you. That's Padlet. The next one is Slack. Another one like this would be Microsoft Teams, very similar. And this is also free to download. And it's just a place for you to communicate, share documents, and work together. So I made a Grants 101 Slack channel. It took me like 2 minutes to make this. It doesn't take long. So let's say that Sarah and Kenneth are on my team. I could say, Sarah and Kenneth, the application is done, and then they would be able to see this. I could also attach the application here. I could add a link so that they can have everything just in one spot. And this is like having an email chain, it's just in a different location. That is Slack. And then this is Canva, and Canva is a graphic design tool. And so if you ever need this, whether this is for grant applications or something else, if you ever need something in a certain format, but you don't maybe have the capacity to work on a design, Canva offers many free downloads of different things to help you with design. So those are some resources, and I will put the links to those in the chat right in just a moment.
All right, now we're moving on to step 2, the writing phase.
This is something that I find really helpful. This is from a private foundation, actually, but their tips, I think, can be applied to many different areas of grant funding. And they gave some really simple tips to help your grant application to stand out. So providing a budget that's balanced, that's really important. Kenneth will talk more about that, but making sure your budget makes sense. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. And so what they're saying by that is that if you have a program that's already working really well and you want to expand it, for example, that's great. If you've read about another program in another community that works well, that you want to do something similar, that's great. So that was a tip they gave. Share your work. Don't be afraid to show how your programs have been successful in the past, how you do have the capacity to do this great work. And don't be afraid to show that with data, both numerical data, program participant data, and just qualitative data through surveys. Make sure that the impact of your program is matching those funding priorities. We talked about that. If a funding opportunity says, we want to support youth and your program supports adults over the age of 50, it's probably not a great match. So just making sure you're that great fit. And then adhering to those deadlines like we talked about, which just making sure everything gets in on time. So I really like those tips because I think sometimes I thought the tips that I would see from funders would be like, what word am I looking for? Really specific or something I couldn't attain, like show us that this program got these ratings for 50 years. But really what it is they want to be able to clearly see the impact. They want to see that the funding that they're providing is going to make a difference. They want to see the same thing you do, that there is a need there's a need that is being met that currently isn't, and that it's going to make a difference. So you know how to show that, so go ahead and show it is really what they're saying here, and I like that.
So now we're moving on to what to expect in the application. As you've reviewed everything, you're ready to start writing. There are different components. And again, NOFOs, the Notice of Funding Opportunities that government entities put out, or requests for proposals or requests for applications. Every entity will have its own format, but here are some of the key components that you generally see in applications. First up is your executive summary. I, especially having come from most recently workforce development, I really like the idea of thinking of your executive summary as the cover letter for your application. Just like you want your resume cover letter to really show who you are and be your bragging point, a way to draw the reviewers in, same with your executive summary for your grant application. This is your opportunity to talk about who your agency is, what the proposed program will do, specifically how it will address the need. But you're going to hear a theme from Sarah and Molly and me today, and that is follow the instructions. Do the instructions in the NOFO or RFP tell you to give specifics, or do they want you to be general? So as you're writing this cover letter to really show yourself off, make sure you do hit the specifics on, should you say how much money you're asking for? How many people are you planning on serving? How long is the program? All of those details. Or should it really just be your show-off letter? Use this executive summary as a tool to make sure that your proposal is clear and meaningful. What I mean by that, as you've written your grant application and as you've written your executive summary, they should match. They should really make sense. There are different schools of thought. One is that you could write your executive summary first, so that then as you write your proposal, you're staying on track and staying true to what you have planned. Or you could write it last. After you've written your complete application, your project is clear, you've written out your budgets, writing the executive summary is a way to summarize it and show it off quickly. But they're both ways will help you keep your writing on track, and it's a way to do checks and balances. Neither writing it first nor last is necessarily the right way, but going through and making sure you match up is critical, because this executive summary is a way to, again, pique the funder's interest, show them that you can follow instructions, or it could also be a way for the reviewers to weed out a weak application. Yes, they probably will still read your application simply to make sure that there's equity in reviewing all apps. But trust me, as a long-term reviewer, we remember those weak cover letters. We remember those executive summaries that don't really show us that you're professional and you're ready to do what you say you're going to do. So the program information, this is the meat. We're going to cover each of these specifically, but the program information components you generally see are about capacity, showing how much you can do, showing what's needed, not only at your agency, but in the community, what the plan is, how you're going to do what you're going to do, and then what it is you're going to do. What are your goals? What's your success that you're planning for? Yes, we all want to say we'll meet 100% of our goals, but we also know that may not be realistic. We also know, especially maybe a pilot program, your outcomes may not be as high as you expect. But what will your outcomes be? Each of these components we're going to talk about a little bit more in the next slides.
First, we're going to talk about applicant capacity. So that's asking yourself and your organization questions like, who are you? What is your relationship to the target population? How do you explain yourself? Like, how do you explain what you do? Like we did in the chat, what do you say your mission is and what do you do? What other projects have you accomplished that have worked really well? Who do you partner with? Who else in the community helps you out with your work? What are some of the qualifications of your agency? What things make your staff shine? I know there's so many different training opportunities. So is there a certain training that your staff completes every year that makes them especially qualified to complete their work? Have you completed similar projects? And what resources do you have available? What already is set up for you to succeed with this work? These are some great questions to ask about where you're at and where you're looking to go. So next, I'm going to talk about, once you talk about what you can do and where you're at, where is there a need? So who is the target population you're serving? And describing that both demographically and geographically. So when we're talking about grant applications, being pretty specific about where are services being provided geographically. Is it a city? Is it a neighborhood within a city? Is it a certain zip code? And really explaining that to the funder. What are some of those needs of the target population that you serve? And how did you identify those needs or problems? Was it through surveys or interviews or census data? How did you learn that that need was a need? What are some of the causes of this? What are some of the situations of your community and your state that maybe caused this need? Is there documentation that exists to support that there is an identified need or problem? And that could be both qualitative and quantitative data. I love this question. Why is it important that you receive this funding? What will, and conversely, what will happen if you don't? What happens to the individuals who are receiving your services if you don't receive this funding? What will they do? Is this need being addressed somewhere else locally? Is there, and if the answer is yes, then why is there a need for it to be duplicated by your agency, or are you looking to partner with where it's already happening? And then a really key part is to only include the need or problem you intend to address. It's likely that your organization or your agency addresses maybe a couple of different issues, but if you're looking to fund one program, for example, and it doesn't have to do with another need that you address, focus on the program that you're looking to get funding for. So when we're thinking about documenting a need and showing evidence for that need, I think this graphic can really help out. So thinking about, okay, nationally, what's going on? So I'll give an example. Let's say that we're looking at homelessness, for example. So like nationally, what's going on with homelessness, what's happening with national demographic information, services, etc. Then we move to the state level. What's happening within our own state? And then how is that played out locally? And how does that compare and contrast to what's helping out elsewhere or what's going on elsewhere? So that's one way to think of it and to document that need.
So next up, we're talking about the operational plan and the scope of work. This is what those of us who come from a program management background consider the meat of what we're going to do. So what is the solution to the problem? How will your approach really fix and help the problem? What's your plan? How are you going to do it? What steps specifically? And when we talk about the steps, again, read the instructions in the NOFO or the RFP. They'll be clear on what's the timeline, how long are you probably going to receive funding for, but talk about what will the steps take. You may not be able to start up right away. You need to incorporate that into the steps, the action plan. Talk about the goals and how you solve the problem. Do you hear the theme? It's all about what's needed and how will this program specifically address that need. In a moment, we'll talk about how to make really clear objectives, how to make a plan that says what your goal is, how to get there, and what the outcomes will be. The methodology is important because, again, the theme we're telling you repeatedly today, match up how you're implementing your program with what the funders are really asking for. If I wanted to do a training program, yet my scope of training is outside of the acceptable methodology of the funder, we won't get funded, no matter how great the idea may be. Talking about how it'll be managed. It's something that especially a lot of sometimes smaller entities that are in the work and in the meat of doing activities don't realize that a funder really needs to know, again, about that accountability. Who's going to be overseeing the day-to-day operations? How will we get feedback from the participants? How will it be managed and overseen? And again, always tying the objectives back to the identified need or problem.
So as you're looking at your outcomes and your performance measures that you can expect from receiving this funding, a good place to start is to create some SMART goals. So those are the specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely goals. And those goals can really help to drive your work plan and predict some of what your outcomes might be. So like I mentioned, those SMART goals help to create your work plan, and you can even divide the goals into smaller sub goals to help drive that work plan. A good rule of thumb is that as you assign staff members to different timeline or work plan items, you might want to include their titles rather than their names if that helps you, or if you have transition within your organization, and making sure that each of these goals can directly be related to your needs statement. So I just made this little table on the right as a place to start with some of your SMART goals of putting each of the goals as a work plan item, setting a date to it, and that has to go with the timely piece, and it helps to keep the program moving and to sort of give a funder an idea of where they can expect progress, and then the staff member assigned to it. Here's a really helpful chart for writing SMART goals. It's from the SAMH, and it talks about just some questions that you can think about or some points you can think about while we're looking at specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. So with your goal, are you defining what you expect, determining what you will do? Are you using action verbs? In terms of measurable, are you talking about a percentage or a number? I think of this example with resume writing a lot, with saying, I taught people, I think the example I gave last week was I taught people how to tie their shoes. That statement, which tells me what you did, but very more specifically, if you said, I taught 15 people how to tie their shoes over the course of 3 weeks, then I have a really good picture of what you accomplished and in what time frame. Attainable, again, that goes back to your capacity and making sure that you have the capacity to reach these goals. Relevant, making sure that the goal that you're setting aligns with your needs statement. And then time bound, giving yourself a bit of a timeline. 2 work plan examples that I'll share with you just to kind of lay this out in a grant format. So this is from a pre-apprenticeship grant that was released a little while ago, a NOFO. And here's an example of a project implementation plan looking at the activity. This could be where you put one of your goals, the timeline, the responsible staff, and then what is that deliverable? Whether that's students being able to demonstrate that they can tie their shoes, or a pamphlet, or what's going to be the outcome of this goal. Here's another one, and this one might be an example of more of an internal work plan or workflow that you might use. It's a little bit more detailed, and it goes through key activities and then in what months of the year those will be completed. This can be helpful when you're looking at a project at a larger scale and for your own organization. So you can use this to plan out your year and look at when activities are happening around when activities that occur annually for you already happen. So, always keeping in mind if your biggest event is in October every year, that's probably not the month you're going to want to put the largest part of this grant implementation because you're already at max capacity. So this is really helpful when you're planning out things like that. So sustainability, I mentioned we talk about this earlier, and this is an important one. So the goal often with this grant funding is that programs can continue beyond the period of funding or expand beyond the period of funding. And so it's good to ask yourself questions like, how will you continue or grow this program once this funding source is complete? Will you be collaborating with other organizations to share some of those resources to continue? Will you be finding other grant funders? Do you have donors who will help? I'm also thinking, does this grant funding fund your entire project, or will you be needing to pull in other sources now immediately to fund the project? So I have on the next slide, I have a couple more ideas just to think about. So let's say that you do need additional funding now to make this project happen. And this particular source of funding is just one piece of the puzzle. Or you're thinking more long-term about how will we sustain this project once this funding period is over. So a couple of different things you can consider depending on what type of organization you are, what your fundraising rules are, things like that, are looking into additional grants. Something that I didn't realize when I first started grant writing was that I thought that it would be bad if I showed that we received other grant funding, because I thought then the grant funding I was applying to wouldn't want to fund us because they'd say, oh, they're already funded by someone else. But what happens is that shows some variability. It shows some consistency in your funding because you have other sources of funding to fall back on, whether that's donors or grants, etc. So that when this funding goes away, everything doesn't go away. There's other pieces in place. Just like in business, having different streams of funding provides a little bit more sustainability. Do you have major donors who might want to pick up on this program once your funding goes away? Could you do a pledge program? Could you do something like asking 5 donors to commit $1,000 a year for 5 years to keep it going after, or whatever funding needs you need? And then finally, are there local foundations or local employers that you could partner with? I know sometimes employers have programs for their employees where a certain percentage of their paycheck can come out to go to donate right to a nonprofit. So is that a possibility for your organization?
So next up, we're going to talk about some of the standardized forms that you may see in, especially when we're talking about budgets and forms for federal or state grants. Government entities will often use the same forms over and over. And new grant writers or new programs that haven't been funded from a government entity before sometimes will get scared and overwhelmed. Go slowly through them and just get familiar with them before you panic and put in information incorrectly. We have another training, I think Molly or Sarah might put in the chat box, specifically on GATA. That's a term that for newcomers may be overwhelming. GATA is simply the Grant Accountability and Transparency Act. It's a way to make sure that government grants are standardized, that there's fairness across the board. It provides some uniformity so that reviewers and submitters all have a general idea of what to expect. Other standardized forms you may see, the Notice of State Award often is standard across all grants, but what we're going to focus on right now are some of the budget issues. I'm going to say this really clearly, and I know Sarah and Molly will back me up on this. The budget is often the weakest part of an application. For newcomers or for entities that haven't been funded previously before, it can be scary. I remember years ago, the first time writing a grant, I was a program manager, not a specific grant writer. And when it came to the budget, I was like, you have to give this to the CFO. When actually writing the budget should be, if you have a team of people working together to submit your grant, it should include everyone, because a well-planned and well-written budget really tells the story of your project in dollar terms. It's a way to show that the impact of your program really will matter on your community need. So it's not that the budget forces the program to be one thing or the program forces the budget to be another thing. They drive each other to make sense. So submitting the strong budget, kind of what we've said all along. What the budget will do is demonstrate that your program is feasible. Is it realistic? Will it really happen? Is it meaningful? Will it make a bang for the buck? Let's say I wanted to train certified nursing assistants and I only have an idea to service maybe 5 students. That may not be a big bang for the buck when another agency is submitting a grant providing training to 15 people. It's not a good bang for the buck. So you really need to think about, what are you talking about, and does your budget make sense to be worthwhile, if you will, to the funder? Also demonstrates responsibility. Are you assuring that expenses make sense and you're using the funds wisely? I really like this table. There are 3 things, and this could cover our personal lives too. Are the budgets and the monies that we're expecting to spend logical? For instance, are they allowable? Again, read the instructions on that NOFO or RFP. So the things you're writing into your budget, are they specifically permitted by the funder? Are they consistent? Does the NOFO or RFP say you can bill the grant for this? Are the expenses you're asking for to be paid reasonable? I can think of a time where I was reviewing a grant application and the executive director's salary was 100% written into the budget request. Not really reasonable. It was allowable. The grant allowed for that person's salary to be paid for. However, as a reviewer, I knew the ED was not going to spend 100% of her time working on this particular program. It wasn't really reasonable. Also, it showed that the ED's salary at a certain dollar amount was exorbitantly higher, as often happens, than the line staff. Sure, it might have been allowed, but was it reasonable? And did it make the reviewers think that the agency was trustworthy with their dollars when we could see the disproportionate percentages and the disproportionate salaries? Is it allocable? Similar to what I said a minute ago, will the ED really be working 100% on the grant application? Does it make sense that what you're asking for is specifically necessary for the program to succeed? Is it appropriate? Is it allowable? Is it reasonable? Is it allocable? As a new grant writer and a program that maybe is new to submitting documents, there's some terms that you hear a lot. We just want to make sure you're comfortable, because that's the purpose of this Grants 101, is to make sure that you're comfortable and don't get overwhelmed when submitting. Go back and read those instructions. But some of the terms that you hear frequently: line item, that just means something that's specifically written into the grant. Discretionary, we talked about previously. Can you do with it what you want? Or is it non-discretionary, meaning it's limited to specifically what the NOFO or RFP says? Matching funds. I know Molly mentioned earlier that sometimes employees will generate income by offering up sponsorship, and the agency could match. Matching funds generally, especially in a government entity grant writing process, is something different. Matching sometimes means if you receive funding from another government entity, this new funder may accept those and show a percentage. Read the terms really carefully in the description to see what that NOFO or that RFP's definition of matching funds are. Narrative we talked about earlier, it just means your story. Use your budget in words. And indirect and direct, we're going to talk about on the next slide, because this is an area where a lot of grant writers and programs get overwhelmed and panic a little bit when they're writing their budgets. So basically, direct costs are things that can be specifically identified with your project. Let's use a simple example that I mentioned earlier. Let's say we wanted to train nursing assistants. If I can show specifically that the nursing assistant students' uniforms or their books are directly tied to the project, that's probably a direct cost. An indirect cost, however, is something that may be necessary for the program to succeed, but may not be 100% logically tied to the project. For instance, those nursing assistants need to come into the building and use the internet. So maybe a portion or a ratio of our internet is paid for by this project, or the security guard in the building, necessary, but her salary may not need to be 100%. This project may not need to be paid for. So in general, I'm seeing a budget from Kyle, and I'm going to come back to it. But yes, you need to think about, Kyle's asking about how to determine if your costs are reasonable. When some budgets are written, you can compare them to something in the NOFO called an estimated cost rate. And they may give a cost band of what they expect, for instance, a certified nursing assistant student to cost. Check those out. You could also talk with your community partners. You could check around and see what other agencies that you know of are doing and how much they're charging or costing. What are the salaries at the other entities? So there are different ways you can be creative, and we can talk more about that after to see how other entities are finding out to determine if their estimated costs are reasonable. It's a great question. Thank you. So as we threw in a sample of what you might see, just showing you some pictures again, so you don't panic when you're submitting your grant applications. Here's a sample from one of our NOFOs that shows the different sections of a budget template. The section A, we've kind of talked about the summary, your indirect cost rate. Something we didn't talk much about is your indirect cost rate sometimes is a negotiated rate by the federal government. For new entities, you may not have that. So you'll need to read in the NOFO, how do you get that maximum indirect rate? Goes back to that reasonability. Those next sections, again, getting you comfortable with what you'll see in the NOFO. All of these are listed out. You go through each one separately. Section C, that worksheet, I believe we've talked about a little bit, and we'll see on the next slides. Right there. Each entity may have a different spreadsheet. Sometimes they actually even have the formulas built in there for you. So here's the trick that I learned the hard way once submitting a budget application. My finance person at my agency changed the formulas in the budget Excel spreadsheet, and we submitted the grant with the formulas changed. The grant was rejected because none of the budget was correct. Really carefully see what you're given in the NOFO or the RFP and follow it. So when you're writing your budget narrative, make sure that everything that's on this spreadsheet has an explanation. Some of the spreadsheets from in a NOFO or an RFP will actually have a line off to the side, a column off to the side where you write your narrative. That's my favorite because you can't miss a step. If you're doing your narrative separately, just go through your budget line by line and write a simple sentence. For instance, I talked earlier about the certified nursing assistant program, for instance. Your narrative could say, similar to that SMART objective that Molly talked about, the salary for the teacher will be salary for teacher to provide 40 hours of lessons weekly with 15 students over this 9-month period. Salary total is, and you put in the amount. Make your language match up with what's on the spreadsheet. So it will really be a way to show how the project will work. It also will show how it'll continue. If you have matching funds or in-kind funds, other sources of supporting that teacher, that other 20% of her salary, talk about that and show how it works. But here's another tip when you're submitting your budget narrative and your budget. If we're seeing, as a reviewer, seeing something for the very first time on your budget sheet or in your budget narrative that hasn't been discussed in your program description, that's a red flag. If you're throwing in here for the very first time that the uniforms are important or the teacher's salary is important, that makes the reviewers think, why didn't they talk about that earlier in the program narrative? Everything needs to match and be repetitive and be consistent. So that narrative is really how to show what you're going to do, what it's going to cost, how it's going to be sustained, and the impact it's going to have on the community and your program. Does that make sense, I hope? So basically, tell that story. Because we have a large number of people online today, we maybe won't do this right now, but think about this on your own time. You can put it in the chat if you wanted to bounce one off of Molly, Sarah, or myself. Think about the items on your budgets. How could you describe them to be explicit about how they match up, not just to this project, but also to your agency's mission and then community need? Tell that story.
Okay, we're going to enter phase 3, submitting your application. So I know it's been said at least 1 or 2 times during this presentation, but turn your application in on time. Underline, highlight, circle the deadline, do it the day before, like Molly said, but make sure it's turned in on time and complete. Do not scan your application. Save this as a PDF. This is going to help the staff or reviewers who are reviewing your application. And when I'm done reading this, I'll exit and show you how to save something as a PDF as well. Make sure all the signatures are in order and up to date. Add page numbers. This is really helpful for reviewers. Oftentimes, reviewers will be reviewing more than one application. Applications are lengthy and things run together. So it's helpful to give those reviewers or people who are looking over your grant the page numbers so they can reference things back. Also, table of contents are so helpful. Word, and I'm sure YouTube or Google can tell you how to do a table of contents very easily, and it can auto-generate as well. And when in doubt, check on Grammarly. This is not a sponsored webinar, but Grammarly is your best friend when it comes to submitting any kind of professional article, application, anything like that. It's such a great resource, and it'll make sure that your audience understands what you're trying to say. And do not alter the requested formatting. I know that it is often tempting to want to stand out from the crowd when you're submitting an application, but that is not a helpful thing for some grants. Some, I can't speak for foundation grants, that might be different, but I can tell you that do not alter the requested formatting for many grants is going to be a helpful phrase for you to remember. And I'm going to go ahead and show you how to save something as a PDF. Molly, can you see the screen, or Kenneth, like the file?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to go to save as. And if you see right down here, it says file format, PowerPoint presentation.
Oh, we don't see now.
Oh, okay. Well, I will, what if I do this? Sorry, all. Let me try this one more time. Okay. How about now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm in save as, it says file format. I want to hit that, and then I go to PDF. That's all I click. And it'll auto generate the PDF, which will be easy for you to put onto any website to submit or email. And that's going to be really helpful to people. So I'm going to go ahead and start the presentation again and send it back to Molly.
So as you're looking to document need or looking to substantiate with data, we have some data sources for you. There's the American Community Survey data, which is from the US Census. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has a lot of employment data for you. And then the Illinois Department of Employment Security also has some state data as well. A great place to look is from your local economic development organization. They often have regional landscapes and regional data. Looking at your own annual report and information you already collect and share. And then additionally, local United Way offices often have local needs assessment or local data. And then here are just some different links and resources for you that we went over throughout this presentation, or places for you to look for a little more details. I think this is our last slide. So we'd love to take some moments now to answer questions. You can post questions in the chat. We can unmute you. I do see we did get one question from Kyle a little while ago. And that question was, how do you find out which other organizations are competing for the same grant?
For a government RFP or NOFO, Bidders Conference is a great way to see who might be interested. For instance, we have bidders conferences that are open for anyone who's interested. Not everyone who attends obviously applies, but it gives you an idea. For some other entities like a foundation grant, you might not know. Use your networks, talk to your community partners if you're involved in any community forums, but you might not. Sarah, Molly, any additional ideas?
Some entities or foundations will publish a list of organizations that they are currently funding or have funded in the past, but it will take some digging on your behalf. Google's probably your best bet, and then maybe also reaching out to the funding organization to see if they can point you in a good direction.
Yeah, my only other idea would be if you have a regional organization or how do I want to describe this? An annual, a regional convening of individuals and organizations who serve your specific population, that would be a good place. The example I'm thinking of right now is in homelessness. There's continuums of care at the local level, a gathering of local agencies who provide services to individuals experiencing homelessness. So you could look around there. That would be a good place too if you needed to find a agency to partner with to apply. And I'm sure that other populations as well have local gatherings like that. That might be a good place to look.
One last place you might want to check, if hopefully you're in good terms with your local political representative in Chicago area, for instance, things like your alderman. Sometimes they know because entities may reach out to them and inappropriately think that they could have special pull. So they may know who else is applying. Be a good opportunity if you find out someone else that you know, or maybe that you don't know is applying. It might be an opportunity for consider ways to partner also if you can find out in advance. But you just might know, so shoot your best shot and answer everything as clearly as you can that NOFO or RFP asks for.
We got a question about this presentation PowerPoint, and I put a link to the Illinois WorkNet page for this, the JTED NOFO, which also has, we did Grants 101 as well last week. The recording is there, and then the recording for future TA sessions in this one will be there as well. Are there other questions? I don't see other questions at the moment. Oh, Jennifer noted that written materials are helpful. So I will find out about like a PDF of the PowerPoint. Sarah or Kenneth, do you think having a PDF of the PowerPoint on WorkNet is something we could find out about?
Yeah, we can do that.
Okay, awesome. Okay, everyone. Well, thank you so much. We're so glad you're here. Keep looking on that webpage. There are future TA sessions coming up real soon. There's lots of other opportunities to learn, and we hope you all have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.